You're watching Breakthrough News.
I'm Charlotte thun-hohenstein, and you're watching Breakthrough News on BTR Today. On today's show, we're talking about the continuing crisis in the Middle East with ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria, and specifically the recent beheading of Steven Sotloff. With me to discuss this is John Neffel of Radio Dispatch. Thank you, John, for joining me today.
Great to be here.
So the first thing, obviously this is extremely worrying. It's the second beheading we've seen after James Foley was recently beheaded. How has this changed the tone around this crisis, if at all? But it seems like there's new urgency to the situation and the way that the government is addressing it.
It certainly does seem that way, especially in the rhetoric. I mean, yesterday you had Joe Biden say that he was going to follow ISIS to the gates of hell, which is reminiscent of something that I think John McCain said about Al-Qaeda, if I remember correctly. So you sort of see this elevated rhetoric again. After the murder of James Foley just a little bit ago, you also saw Obama's rhetoric get a little bit more elevated, a little bit more bombastic. I mean, I think that when it comes to these kind of gruesome, horrific acts by ISIS, they're designed for one of two things. And I think that it's people who say that it's barbarism just for the sake of barbarism aren't thinking through the problem clearly enough. I think that if you're ISIS and you do these horrific acts, challenging the United States directly to intervene, if the U.S. does intervene, then they can claim a victory and say that they are on equal footing. They can attempt to draw the U.S. into another unpopular war. And if you look at the origin of ISIS, it was a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, started by a guy named Zarqawi. His entire goal with AQI was to foment civil war in Iraq and to heighten sectarian divisions between Sunni, which is the sect that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are, and between the Shia majority in Iraq. And so if ISIS is able to either get the United States to commit to ground troops or to even more so-called advisors and airstrikes, that may very well be their ultimate motivation. On the other hand, if the United States doesn't commit more forces, they can claim a victory as well and say, look at how scared the great beast is, and we're showing how weak they are. And so I think that as much as the acts themselves are horrifying and criminal and awful in just about every way you could possibly imagine, I think that it would be a mistake to not see them also as a strategic political move in a sort of backwards and macabre way.
So, I mean, what you've described is pretty much a lose-lose situation for the US, right? So in this instance, then how seriously do we take their stated purpose of getting back at the US for the strikes against them recently in the north? You know, I mean, because that's their explicit claim.
Yeah, right. I think that as a sort of proximate cause isn't especially persuasive. ISIS wants to control territory. When you look at maps that the previous iteration AQI drew, it actually looks very similar to the map that exists right now in terms of the territory that ISIS does control. They also are interested in controlling resources and essentially running mafia-like extortion and protection rackets. The next phase for them is going to be whether or not they can govern as easily as they can go into these sort of vacuum territories in the north, where there was already a lot of hatred of the Iraqi central government in Baghdad, and of course there are numerous vacuums in Syria that they have exploited. So I don't think that the sort of a recent bombing here or there is insufficient to explain ISIS's motivations. Although at the same time, I don't think that there's any clear evidence that ISIS is planning imminent attacks on the U.S. homeland. And I think that that's also important to remember, that whenever you have the enemy du jour, which is what ISIS is, that they're quote unquote more extreme than Al-Qaeda, which is, if not incorrect, it's a mischaracterization of the feud between the two groups. I think that we should be afraid of allowing political and military elites to elevate the threat level and push for more militarism and empire expansion.
Can you just elaborate a bit more, because you sort of touched on this, on what is new about ISIS as a terrorist group? Because certainly they seem much more sophisticated than their counterparts, much savvier, and even in their use of the web and finding new recruits, it's actually quite scary how effective they are. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. I mean, their social media presence has been regularly commented on. They regularly sort of hijack Twitter hashtags and post gruesome photos of people that they've murdered. They're obviously known for taking video of mass executions. There was just an Amnesty report that said that ISIS may have killed as many as 700 Iraqi soldiers. But I think one of the things that makes them different is this idea of setting up a caliphate. I mean, when you had insurgencies that were loosely affiliated with Al-Qaeda in the time of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq, there were places like Fallujah where the U.S. influence and central Baghdad government influence wasn't very strong, but you didn't have anything like now. And when you look at the other Al-Qaeda offshoot that until this new enemy du jour, the other Al-Qaeda offshoot called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they were never able to, or really I think interested in, establishing a territory that they dominated and that they ran. And what some people say is that this is ISIS's attempt to create a sort of safe haven for terrorists to then attack the West, to return radicalized. Again, I think that a lot of those threats, especially in the United States, are at least for now exaggerated and premature. And to the extent that U.S. citizens are going to Syria or Iraq to fight, that in and of itself doesn't prove that they will return to the U.S. and kill Americans. As we've seen through decades of mass shootings, if you live in America and you want to kill Americans, you don't have to go to Syria first before you do it. Right,
although naturally one would still be very concerned about what they might do upon return.
Yeah, sure, but there's a long history of people of all shapes and sizes and belief systems who travel abroad to fight in wars and don't commit acts of heinous violence when they return. George Orwell is one of them. He went to Spain to report on the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, and he ended up fighting fascists. This is a point that Marcy Wheeler made. When he was there, he realized that the people he was fighting with were not the sort of pure army that he thought they were. And I think that's a point that she's made that I think we also have to think about, is that if you're 19 years old, you have and the only thing that you've been brought up with is a sort of neoliberal ideology that doesn't speak to you. Maybe Islamism does. Now, does that mean that you will return to commit acts of heinous violence? It could. It could also mean that you will return and be completely disillusioned with what you thought was filling the vacuum. And I think that that sort of prosecuting or necessarily treating anyone who travels abroad to fight in a war as a future terrorist is a big mistake.
We are going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment after this quick excerpt from the latest episode of Live Studio featuring White Hinterland. Don't give us down on a road too soft.
it doesn't mean you can't get back. It's sad this song will be the last I ever write, but I also said.
We're back with our discussion on the recent developments in the Middle East and the beheading of Stephen Sotloff. One of the things that you mentioned before, John, was Syria. How is ISIS and this whole mess changing the way that we're actually dealing with Assad and approaching that original crisis?
Yeah, well, as you said before, when it comes to ISIS, the U.S. I think largely is in a lose-lose situation. When it comes to Syria, you need words that are stronger than lose-lose. There are absolutely no good options for the Obama administration in Iraq. There really never have been. And I think that any hawks, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, people like that, who say that if only Obama had armed quote-unquote moderates a year ago, 2 years ago, then we wouldn't be in this situation. I think that that's disingenuous and incorrect.
Well, we are going to have to wrap up there. Thank you very much, John, for joining me. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from our most recent edition to Serious Business on BTR TV featuring Baked, presented by Exploding in Sound. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte thun-Hohenstein and this is BreakThru News, your window into today. Be sure to check out breakthrough.radio.com through the weekend for our continued binge week coverage, including an op-ed by Jess Goulart on whether or not it's possible to be addicted to travel. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @BreakThruRadio. I'm Charlotte thun-Hohenstein and thank you for joining us.